discovered that Russia was not the pushover and the weak state that they had anticipated. But as we've discussed in the past, there was no strategic analysis done. Right now, I think things are falling apart so quickly in Ukraine that there's not much left for the Ukrainian government to do. The only reason there is still a Ukrainian government at all sitting in Kiev is because the Russians have chosen not to destroy it. And I think what we're going to witness in the near future is a major operation involving a large number of Russian troops that will in fact cross the Dnieper, something that really hasn't been at the top of Putin's list. Now, they've always kept bridges intact across the Dnieper for the purpose of using them at some point. We know that they still want to seize Odessa, which is historically a Russian city, just as they want to control Kharkov, which is historically a Russian city. But much beyond that, I don't think Moscow is interested. Unfortunately, they may not have a choice because no one will step forward and negotiate. Now, that's at the moment. There are lots of other things happening, and we need to talk about those. The situation in Europe is changing. It may be that in Norway, there is quiet and stability. But that's certainly not true on the continent. And what happens on the continent is far, far more important than what happens anywhere else in Europe. France is on the verge of revolution. I don't know how much people are paying attention to events in Paris. Not only is Mr. Macron finished as a president, the attempt to replace him with another homosexual globalist, which appears to be underway right now, is not going to work. The French populace is now arising from its long sleep, if you will. The French army is not like the armies of other NATO states. It's extremely nationalistic. It's committed first and foremost to the French state and the French nation. So these patriots in uniform in the French army are not going to stand idly by. We're going to see a major meltdown and then a rebound of the French nation. This is going to change everything. The rumors of all sorts of strange things occurring are almost endless. I was reading in a French outlet some discussion about the attempt to call on assistance from, quote unquote, the EU and NATO to intervene in France to prevent this revolution from occurring, which is kind of laughable. I mean, NATO can't intervene anywhere with ground forces to do much of anything. But now they're talking about introducing foreign ground forces into France. Well, that certainly worked very, very well back in 1789 to 1790, if anybody bothers to go back and look at it. The French smashed the Brunswickers who came in from the Holy Roman Empire, or at that time, the Habsburg German nation, to try and stop the revolution. It failed miserably. If anybody's even thinking about it, they're crazy. I think France is going to be in substantial turmoil. I think that's going to change the approach to Russia, because I think eventually the government that comes to power there is going to renounce this war against Russia. And the French are going to focus internally. And it's not just France. I think we're going to see Germany walk a similar path. Obviously, Germans are Germans, not Frenchmen. But you will see a governmental change in Germany, and they too will walk away from this war against Russia. But I think what you're really seeing with Washington is a last desperate effort to maintain the facade. They would like to see Zelensky survive at least until the November elections. I don't think that's possible. I think he'll be gone before that. But remember, the status quo thinkers in Washington, D.C., who rarely see change until it bites them in the neck, they're looking at things and they're saying, well, if we can just keep Zelensky in power and create the illusion that there is this thing called the Ukrainian government and things are holding together, well, then perhaps we can avoid the embarrassment that we suffered with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Remember, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was horrendous. It was an exercise in gross military incompetence, which, by the way, would have happened under Trump, too, because the same general officers that were hopelessly incompetent that directed this disaster were there under President Trump. So there was no change from President Trump to President Biden. The same actors were there. And I think they would like to avoid that. And their attitude will be, if we can get through the election, then what happens after the election doesn't matter anymore. And that's typical Washington thinking. They're not looking carefully at Western Europe. They're not looking carefully at Eastern Europe. They're not looking carefully at Russia and what's happening there, let alone anywhere else. They see everything through a very distorted lens that presupposes that what you have today will continue without interruption long into the future. It's called linear thinking. And it's killing us because it's not going to turn out that way. France is a bellwether. Remember Metternich, the famous Austrian foreign minister, he said, when Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. Watch carefully. Europe is about to catch quite a cold. And the United States is not far behind. We can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Sure, but I thought in France that there's this huge effort now by all the other parties to prevent Le Pen's party from seizing power, and but do you see this
I don't think it
spiraling out of
matters.
control?
I don't think it matters. I don't think Le Pen is the future either. She's too moderate. You're going to get something far, far more radical to the right because that's the only way to save France. And that's the way the French are seeing things. And what is it? 2 out of every 5 citizens in France are adults. 2 out of 5 adults are Muslims, something like that. Their country is at risk of going out of existence. I think the population on the whole has figured that out. Now, there are loyal communists who will resist that the globalists can deploy, much like Antifa or BLM or something, but it's not going to work. I think the French population is now thoroughly awakened, and they're going to demand substantial systemic change. So let us assume that Le Pen wins and Le Pen becomes the governing force initially. She won't last. There'll be more turmoil because the population wants action now. This is what we're going to see across Europe. No one is willing to wait years for something to change anymore. They want change now. They want an end to the criminality in the streets, in their countryside. They want an end to the immigration problem. They want a restoration of national strength. These things will have to happen relatively quickly. They can't wait years for this to occur. So whoever comes to power next doesn't matter. They'll be temporary residents and then they'll be gone. Think of everybody who comes to power in Europe as a kind of Kerensky. Remember, Kerensky comes to power, and how long was he in power? What, 8 months, 9 months or something? Because he never did what was required. And what did Lenin promise? Bread and peace, effectively. In other words, no more war, an end to that. And then we're going to feed everybody. And that's what people in Russia at the time demanded. Now, they didn't realize what they were going to get from Lenin. And he was a maniac, as we all know. We don't need to go down that particular path and talk about the millions of people he murdered. That's not what we're going to see from the right. What we're going to see from the right is simply order that people want and a restoration of national identity, culture, and strength. Those things will come. You don't have to kill millions of people to do that by any means. And it's not necessary and it won't happen. But it's going to be somewhat violent. It has to be. I mean, this is pent up emotion and anger that's been brewing, for years. Now it's finally bursting through the surface.
Well, back to on the topic of the escalation with the American contractors. What do you see the significance there? I mean, it feels like one step before one might introduce actual soldiers, or maybe it's just instead, but nonetheless.
You can't introduce any soldiers. The Army, the U.S. Army isn't prepared to go in there. It's incapable of going in there. It's incapable of offensive warfare. Someone said to me the other day that when they look at the U.S. Army in Eastern Europe, they don't see people except women and minorities. This is not the Army of 1990 and 91. We had over 800,000 men in the force at that point. It was a very different army from what you have today. Remember, we are already victims of this sort of globalist diversity, inclusion, equity nonsense, which simply means that anyone who is white is being suppressed. That's where we are. This is not going to last either. So you can't use the Army. Now, could you use the Air Force? Of course, but how long? How much support are you going to get here at home? How cohesive is American society? I would argue not very cohesive. So they're playing a dangerous game. They're really bluffing, and they're bluffing with the use of these long-range strike weapons. I'm sure the Russians are watching carefully to see what shows up, and they will systematically destroy those weapon systems and the people around them. They already destroyed the MLRS systems, or the HIMARS systems, whatever you want to call them, the Army tactical missile systems that were fired at them. They've already destroyed those, and they will continue to do so. So I wouldn't want to be a Western contractor inside Ukraine. They're not going to make it.
And well, I guess another escalation would be the expectation of the first F-16s to arrive now during the summer. Now, it's argued that they will come at an opportune time, given that the West has green-lighted attacks on Russian territory as well. But the problem is the Ukrainians are, and NATO for that sake, are also cautious about stationing them in Ukraine, as they would then likely be hit. But, you know, if they're placed on NATO territory and attack Russian targets, then from Russia's perspective, they would be, these NATO airfields would then be legitimate targets. So it appears
absolutely.
that they're moving to this solution.
Absolutely. Well, remember, you've got something else happening, Glenn. The global hawk that was shot down over the Black Sea was targeted because the Russians asserted that this global hawk had a role to play in the targeting and data transfer to the MLRS systems in Ukraine. I don't know whether or not that's true. We use a lot of space-based surveillance and communications as well to supply the Ukrainians with real-time information and targeting data. But the Russians have said that if you bring any more intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance platforms, manned or unmanned, into the area, into our airspace, or close to it, we'll shoot them down. And the fools in Brussels said, well, that's fine. We'll send up F-15s or manned aircraft to fly escort for the next global hawk we send up. Well, they'll be shot down. Now, the question is, at that point, do we really think that Washington can mobilize the American people to go to war against Russia because Russia has already warned everyone that if you continue to do what you're doing and you bring in manned aircraft to protect the unmanned aircraft, we will shoot them down? I don't see any evidence that they can mobilize the United States for that at all. I don't see the American people backing it. And I am increasingly convinced that the majority of Europeans, maybe not in Norway, I remember when we had problems in the Balkans, the closer you got to the scene of the action, the less enthusiastic people were about intervention there. But the further away you were, Canada, Norway, Sweden, everybody was very excited about bombing Serbs. Well, this time around, I think the Norwegians and others better give it some serious thought, because the Russians aren't going to spare the horses. Now, if the Norwegians host systems that are used to attack Russia, they'll become targets too. So I don't know what people in Norway think, but if you're a German right now, you're an Austrian, you're a Czech, you're a Hungarian or Pole, you're beginning to say, what a minute, wait a minute. Do I want to be drawn into this? Do I want these systems stationed on my soil? Do I want strike packages being flown from Poland, Germany, Italy, Romania into Russia? I don't think so. I think this thing is really coming to an end. It's not just turning a new page in a new chapter. This is the last desperate gasp of Washington to maintain the fiction that something good has happened in Ukraine. That's what this is about.
Well, I guess this is what I'm referring to. Not only the Russians now taking more aggressive steps in the Black Sea to counter American intelligence there and targeting, but in terms of this F-16s, because there seems to be this idea that NATO can keep these planes outside Ukraine and then land them shortly in Ukraine at an airfield, temporary, before taking off again to attack Russia. But and under this guise, they wouldn't be attacking from NATO territory. But it seems very unlikely that the Russians would accept this. Now, I'm not sure if they would go to the length of attacking the NATO airstrips, but it also seems likely that the NATO might use Moldovan airfields, given that they got greater protection for planes. If this is the case, to me, it seems almost certainly that the Russians would bomb the Moldovan airfields. I'm just curious, do you see any similar paths in terms of, does it seem credible that the delivery of the F-16 could be a way of further, demanding, if you will, a more fierce response from the Russians?
Well, the Moldovan airfields sit inside the Moldovan population. The Moldovan population doesn't support the war. The government is a loyal globalist vassal government of greater NATO, but the people that live in Moldova don't want it. That's my point, that if you fly these strikes from these bases, it's not going to work because the populations will not respond favorably to it. Right now, we've already issued orders in Europe that if U.S. military personnel leave any of the bases where they are located in Eastern and Central Europe, that they must take off their uniforms and go out in civilian clothes. Why would that be the case all of a sudden? Because the hostility to our presence in that region is growing. Now you're asking, will the Russians blast to smithereens an airbase? Yes, they will. That's the point. I mean, how many times have the Russians warned us? And the Russians do not bluff. Whatever the Russians say they will do, they carry through. We don't. We talk a great game, but when push comes to shove, we don't carry through. Remember, for the last 2+ years, we've been talking about a NATO ground force rushing into Western Ukraine, setting up some new defense. What's happened? Nothing. It's not going to happen. So that means you're relying exclusively on air and naval systems. Frankly speaking, I would be more concerned about events in the Black Sea or the Baltic than I would right now about F-16s flying anywhere in Central Europe. I think the sea lanes, the open sea where we have U.S. ships, U.S. combatants, Royal Navy combatants, and others, there's a greater opportunity there for confrontation than there is on land. That doesn't mean it's impossible on land. I'm just saying that's the first place I would look. That's why I brought up the Global Hawk. If we are dumb enough to send another unmanned airspace control aircraft up there with its ISR package, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and we send U.S. aircraft to protect it, yeah, we're going to see them shot down. I think that's an absolute certainty. My point is, this is not 1965. In 1965, some of your viewers will remember that we faked an incident in the Tonkin Gulf that really never happened. And that became the trigger for what we call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution that then brought us into Vietnam with ground forces, direct confrontation. I don't see that happening here. And I think Washington, as deranged as it is right now, as disconnected as the globalist ruling class is from reality, they're not going to do that, because if they do, I think their constituents will rise up and tell them no. And if you do this, we will never vote for you again. I keep trying to tell people there is no appetite for war with Russia. None.
Well, yeah, no, I agree, and I think this is often when NATO made the decision to start striking Russian territory, the main argument was, it's not fair in a war that Russia should be a safe territory, which no one would strike. But it was also true that NATO was considered a safe territory. So, we do our proxy fighting within the Ukrainian borders, but now that we took the war into Russia, the voices I hear from Moscow is why should the NATO territory be safe now? Why should we bring the war to them? But I guess the main challenge for this is how it could be done without sparking a direct clash, because no one would want this. Now, obviously, I read in the media about all this arguments that perhaps the Russians are behind, these fires and different sabotage missions across Europe, which I haven't seen evidence, but of course this is very possible. But you also have this idea, well, this thing they already announced they would do, which is sending weapons to third parties. What do you see as the most likely countries or actors to give weapons to? For example, do you see them giving missiles to the Houthis in Yemen to strike British or American warships? Or do you think they haven't gone to that extent yet?
If you look at Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba have always been hostile to the United States and the West. Go all the way back to the Spanish Civil War. Venezuela, Mexico, Cuba supported the communists in Spain against the nationalists. So that's America's soft underbelly, where the massive influx of millions of people coming through the Mexican border has taken place. It's very easy to escalate horizontally, and that's really what Putin has been doing. Horizontal escalation means instead of up and direct, you're escalating around the world. Where has he been? He's been to North Korea. Now, some of your viewers will remember that President Trump went to Hanoi to sign an agreement that had been carefully worked out that was going to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. It would have eventually removed all nuclear weapons from the peninsula, and ultimately, U.S. forces would have gotten out. China supported that, and because the Chinese wanted that, the Russians went along with it. The Russians, or rather the Chinese, would much rather have Korea look like the Republic of Korea, a very thriving, successful society with whom they can trade and work, than this disaster in North Korea, which has essentially been circling the drain for decades as a nation. Its population is declining. Its people are growing shorter because they don't have the right food. They're not eating properly. I mean, we can go on and on and on. But North Korea has always really been Russia's satellite, not China's. For the Chinese, the Koreans are an irritant and a catalyst for conflict. The Chinese do not want conflict in Asia, period. The Russians are different. They see it as a useful strategic hedge against us and Japan. Where else did Putin go? He went to Vietnam. Remember, the Chinese and the Vietnamese have had wars. If there's one group of people the Vietnamese do not want in their country, it's Chinese. But they have good relations with Russia because Russia supported them and assisted them during the long war that they fought with us. So these are examples of where the Russians can go and have an impact. Putin has been very active in the Middle East, not because the Middle East woke up and decided they loved Russians, but because the elites in the Middle East are tired of us. Everyone has said, we're talking about the ruling elites, people like General Sisi and others, that they're tired of listening to Mr. Blinken repeat Mr. Netanyahu's talking points. In other words, we have created the cohesion that characterizes these new alignments against us. That's the problem. The Europeans have been governed by people with no real interest in Europe, with this interest in this new internationalist / globalist approach that takes Europe and turns it into a region that's being denationalized, filled with millions of people who are not Europeans. This is now going to end. It's got to end. The Europeans don't want it. We are in a similar position at home, but we are not as far along in our thinking and behavior as the Europeans, particularly the French. But that's going to happen inside the United States. And to this, you have to add the economic problem. I mean, we're certainly financially ruined, broke for all intents and purposes, but we still print money. We can't do it much longer. And all you have to do is look at the long-term treasury bonds. The 10-year treasury bonds are now approaching 4.7, 4.8%. They'll go up to 5%. When they reach that point, our debt is unsustainable. We can't service it. So you're going to see similar things happen in European countries where the financial conditions are terrible. That is not incidentally true in Norway because Norway has a very good national sovereign wealth fund. It's wonderful. The Norwegians have been very prudent and intelligent in how they've handled their finances. The rest of the Europeans have not. And particularly on the continent, the situation in places like Germany are deplorable. Everything is going to come apart. So we're looking on the one hand at the appearance of escalation. In other words, we're going to keep supporting the Ukrainians no matter what. In reality, Ukraine is about to go under. It's being effectively destroyed as a nation. There's not much left. And we are broke. And we are on the road to financial ruin. And our ground forces are incapable of taking on the Russians and fighting. All we have left is air and naval power. And how good that is open to question when you begin to scratch the surface, particularly in the Navy. So why stand around and worry about escalation that's going to result in a major war? Because that's what people are accustomed to. I don't see how you have a major war break out under these circumstances. What I see that is far more likely is if we push this to the edge and we test the Russians by going back over the Black Sea, doing something stupid, that we will get a bloody nose. And then we will look ridiculous because when you turn and ask the military, we'll go back in and fix this. In other words, attack the Russians, they're going to look at you like, have you lost your mind? The only people inside the current Biden administration who are whispering the truth into anyone's ear are in the Department of Defense because they know our limitations. And we are not in a position to challenge the Russians in the area. We never were. So I think the Europeans are beginning to sense this, but I guess it may take an obvious failure along the lines that we're discussing over the Black Sea or somewhere else to make it clear. I don't know.
Yeah, this limit of resources is, it should be obvious. I mean, even Obama, he made this argument back in 2016 as an argument why we should be cautious about escalating the Ukraine war against the Russians, as it's happening on their border. They have the logistic advantage and thus escalation dominance. But all of this seems to have gone out the window in all this extraordinary war enthusiasm. But yeah, besides the escalations and the dilemma that NATO is at the moment, it seems within Ukraine things aren't going quite well either. The economy is going very bad. If we remember from the previous year, the Russians were of course attacking electric grids, but it was temporary, minor damage. Now they're going after the real heavy, permanent damages. So you see now the electric grid failing huge, and also this obviously has impact on industry, the economy. So the economy is not doing well, and also there's something different happening on the front line as well. Casualty numbers seems to be going through the roof. You're having more and more people defecting, fleeing the battlefield. Of course, this is correlated with the more aggressive, recruitment policies in which people are dragged off the streets. But this seems to be going. This isn't sustainable, it seems to me. How are you reading this situation? Because this is just
militarily on the ground. We estimate that the Ukrainians are losing between 10 and 15,000 killed in action every week. And people are astonished. But that happens at the end of wars, when armies begin to melt away, when things fall apart and you're in full retreat. That's the sort of casualty rate that you experience. This has been true throughout history. It doesn't matter what nation or what army. If you go into this retreat business, you lose more men in the retreat, in chaos, than you did on the battlefield when you were effectively defending or at least holding together. And I could go all the way back to the American experience in the War of 1812, when the British landed not far from Washington. We fought a battle. We were decimated. We outnumbered the British almost 2-1. We fell apart, and by the time the remaining forces reached Washington, D.C., they were perhaps 20% of what they had been to begin with. This is not unusual. The Ukrainians have very little left, and this regime, the Zelensky regime, doesn't appear to be concerned about that. They're busy trying to stuff more cash into their pockets and into their bank accounts, and so they're happy to maintain this facade of strength with what I call vengeance weapons. And that's what they're using these things for, hoping that they're going to get an overreaction out of the Russians that might bring us in or bring in Europe or bring in NATO. It's not going to happen. It's interesting because it's similar in some respects to Mr. Netanyahu's passion for invading southern Lebanon. You know, you've got at least 70,000 severely wounded Israeli soldiers as a result of Gaza. We think 5,000-6,000 may have been killed. We just don't know. Everybody lies about casualties during a war. But the Israeli Defense Force is being damaged. Now you want to take the Israeli Defense Force that's damaged and hurl it at Hezbollah, which is infinitely more challenging than Hamas. Having failed against Hamas in Gaza, now you want to go and attack somebody else. Why? because it offers the opportunity potentially to drag in the United States on the side of Israel to engage directly against Hezbollah. Of course, that has terrible implications strategically for the rest of the region. But if you're Mr. Netanyahu, you don't care. If you're Mr. Zelensky, you don't care. That's the problem right now. But it's, I think we have to understand that, but it's also back again to this issue. It's not just running out of manpower. I think it's becoming harder and harder to conceal the enormous graft and corruption in Ukraine. I mean, billions and billions and billions of dollars have been stolen. The Ukrainian people have not benefited in any way, shape, or form from the aid that is being provided to Ukraine. I think that's becoming clear. But they're disarmed. They don't have the means with which to attack and overwhelm the secret police, the SBU, and get to Zelensky. Zelensky is protected by Western security forces, primarily MI6 and the CIA. So this will drag on until the Russians finally decide they have no alternative but to cross the river. And at that point, I think the game is over. And perhaps at that point, we will see new governments emerge in Europe. Because new governments in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, they can go forward and make peace. They can reach some sort of negotiated settlement with Russia. We can't do that. Washington will not do that. Washington would just as soon sit and watch the war end with the last Ukrainian alive. That's sad, but it's true.
I agree with your assessment of the front line, and it's getting worse as well for the Ukrainians, because not only are they losing more and more men, but of course the Russians are now introducing more and more heavy weapon, with this FAB 3000s being the new one, and more and more the glide bombs, and there's not much they can do to protect from them. And now
they have no air defense, no air or missile defense. And remember, we have no air and missile defense in Europe that is integrated. What we have the capacity, I think, the study done at RUSI, not one of my favorite institutions because they peddled lots of lies about the Russians, but nevertheless, they were truthful in a recent report saying that NATO would be fortunate if it could protect just 5% of its infrastructure from Russian air and missile attack. That's pretty grim. So that's why this whole notion of going to war is absurd.
But as Ukraine appears to be collapsing and Russia responding by effectively opening up new fronts to further thin out the Ukrainians, which it intensifies this collapse, we see now what seems to be at least a change of tone from Kiev as well. I mean, Zelensky was hinting towards the possibility of negotiations, as he argued they can't fight this forever. And also from his administration, there's arguments now that perhaps next time they have this, peace summits, they might actually invite the counterpart, which of course is a good decision if you want to have an actual peace summit. But it seems as we're reaching this breaking point, on one hand, there's this massive escalation with talk of contractors and F-16s and striking Russia with American weapons. And at the same time, there's more suggestions now that there should be negotiations. So I'm just curious, we have to go either way. Do you see a clear path? Is there any prospect for negotiations at this time? Because we keep insisting also that we will not accept effectively anything. We can't accept the Ukrainian neutrality, which has to be the foundation of any peace agreement. So do you see anything, or can there only be a military solution to this conflict now?
I think you've answered your own question. The Russians have no particular incentive to meet with people who are not willing to discuss terms realistically. In other words, what realistically can you discuss with the Russians? We're unwilling to do that. Now, that's why I said if you get the change in government in Paris and then change follows in Germany, we already have sober-minded leadership in Hungary and Slovakia, and there are others I'm sure that would follow in Slovenia and elsewhere. If you get sober-minded people that have a realistic outlook and see the criticality of ending this before there is nothing left of Ukraine, then I guess you could have a negotiated settlement. But it's going to consist of sitting in front of a map and watching Mr. Lavrov or someone else draw a line that outlines what the Russians currently control in eastern Ukraine and probably crosses the river and includes Odessa, as well as Kharkov. So that's what would happen. And nobody's willing to go do that because everyone has bloviated so long about inevitable victory over the backward, incapable Russians who are all evil and deserve to die. They can't do that. So it's going to have to be somebody we haven't seen. You can't put Schultz over there. Who's going to listen to Schultz? It's like Macron. Why listen to anything he says? Why listen to anything that comes out of Washington right now? And the noises that are being made by Trump on the home front are absurd. You know, as though he behaves as though this is 1991 and he can call the shots. He can't. This is going to end one way or the other when the Russians want to end it. And they're going to end it on terms that they can live with. And that means that Western Ukraine, west of the river, has to be neutral. That rump state cannot become a threat again to Russia, period. End of discussion. Now, whatever else they're willing to negotiate, I don't know. But that's an absolutely, preeminent goal that's not up for discussion. And why would they ever negotiate otherwise? We've lied to them about everything. Go back to the biolabs that they've overrun and found. That had malevolent, mendacious, malicious intent from the beginning, terrible things. And go beyond that, look at the plans that existed to hurl this Ukrainian army at Russia itself and Crimea and so forth. I just don't know. People don't seem to have a grip on reality. Why would you bother negotiating with anybody at that point?
Yeah, no, also the impression I get from Putin these days, I mean, I feel like I've seen this before when he, for example, cautioned the West towards the end of 2013, beginning 2014, not to try to topple the government. Didn't listen, then they took this forceful action. And also in end of 2021, we said, gave very clear caution, like either give us security guarantees or you will have a consequence. Now, I got a similar feel from this last offer he gave of a peace agreement when he said, give us restore Ukraine's neutrality and pull out of those 4 regions which Russia has annexed. This is why I was surprised the West blew it off in the way it did, because yes, I can see why it would be difficult to swallow the idea that Ukrainians have to leave territory which they haven't even lost yet, but but not to take advantage of this as a starting point to at least discuss, can we change the administrative line? We can't, the territorial thing obviously makes things much more complicated, but at least it was an opener to sit down, see what their demands are, and then begin negotiations. But just to blow it off like this, I think, like you said, it's convinced the Russians now that they can't deal with the West anymore, and there's only military solution left. I have a hard time understanding why sitting down and talking, as we see now the front lines breaking down, why this is still rejected.
Well, the globalists always demonize, degrade their opponents. In other words, if you go back and look over the last 30 years at us, the series of governments cannot speak to other governments in a civil manner. We have this sort of phony metric by which we measure the moral goodness of a particular country and its leadership. In truth, anybody who opposes us or doesn't want to do what we would like them to do is the enemy, and we tend to characterize them in the worst possible terms. I think this is caught on, and at least in my lifetime, it's been very popular in Europe. It was particularly popular in Germany. Many years ago, an old friend of mine said, it's funny to watch the Germans, and not just the Germans, but the Dutch and others. They have surrendered this sort of old idea of military supremacy or racial supremacy in favor of moral supremacy. Now they've declared themselves to be permanent victims, and they are morally superior to everyone else in the world, and therefore anything they say is good, and what they hear from other people that don't agree with them is bad. I think that's what's happened. How can you negotiate with Mr. Putin, who has been run down in the Western press as some sort of Stalin-like figure? who spent all of his free time executing people in the basement of the Lubyanka prison. It's absurd. It's just ridiculous. Remember this Baerbock, the German foreign minister who went to Moscow and refused to shake the hand of Sergei Lavrov. Who is this little woman who has done nothing in her life to refuse to shake the hand of the Russian foreign minister? Well, she apparently thinks she's superior. This is the problem. These people need to go, need to get the hell out of there. You got to get rid of them. We have to live in the real world, not the fantasy world. My headquarters for Our Country, Our Choice is in Orlando, and we're not far from Disney World. But there's more reality in Disney World right now than there is in Washington, D.C. and much of Europe. So this has got to change. Now, once that changes, then I think you'll see a willingness in Moscow to actually sit down and talk. But right now, I think I would take the same approach that Bonaparte did when he was approached by people in Italy and said, well, you can't do this or you can't do that because after all, that's the Pope in Rome has objected and you could be excommunicated or something. And his answer was, how many battalions has the Pope got? And he brushed it off. And of course, the rest is history. Well, if I were in Moscow right now, my question would be, all right, you've made your point. What are you going to put up? And you got to be very careful because remember, Russia now is ready to fight. Its morale is high. It's taken very few casualties, contrary to the lies promulgated by the press in the West. It is ready to fight. It has armies on the ground. It can raise more. It doesn't want to. That's a different issue, but it can. Its manufacturing base is on a war footing. They're running shifts in factories, turning out missiles, rockets, artillery rounds, new equipment, weapons, you name it. We're not doing that. We're running out of missiles in the United States. And I see no evidence of anybody stepping forward over here and saying, well, let's run 3 shifts a day so that we can produce enough air defense missiles or strike missiles. No, it's not happening. The same slow, ponderous process that's been there for 3 decades is still there. Who are we kidding? So at some point, the bluff is going to be called, and that could be very costly to us.
No, I agree. And I think this is the danger of NATO as well, this false sense of security, because at least in this country and around Europe, what I keep seeing the assumption that we can do anything we want and no repercussion is always the assumption, well, NATO's here, the Americans are here. And at the end of the day, that's a hard stop. And this is where the buck drops. This is where Russia won't dare to do anything. And I think now that Russia's and that's what I think now is happening, being pushed over the line. I think, as you say, they will call this bluff, in which we will either have war or very humiliating and pushback in which we have to adjust to a new reality. But
what we don't want is a large-scale strategic Dunkirk, where we are compelled to ignominiously withdraw from Europe. That would be bad. But it may happen. If they didn't like what happened in Afghanistan, they'll be very unhappy with what happens in Europe if the Russians press forward. And this notion of using nuclear weapons makes no sense. I was called within the last 24 hours by some people who are very prominent on the Hill and in various campaigns for presidency and asked, do the Russians really have more warheads and weapons platforms to launch nuclear warheads than we do? I said, yes. Now, does it matter? As Mr. Putin has pointed out, if we all launch these things, we'll all die. It'll be the end of civilization as we know it. So does it matter that they have 1,500 to 2,000 more nuclear warheads than the United States possesses? Well, I think it does matter. It always matters because people have to look at that and suddenly sober up and realize there is a disparity here. And it would be unwise to challenge your opponent on this level. But again, we're dealing with foolish ideologues. The people in Washington, and I would argue in Paris and Berlin and London and elsewhere, have been playing with military power the way a child plays with a loaded gun, and then points it at the wrong person, pulls the trigger, and causes tragedy because they don't understand what they're doing. I don't see any adults in the room in the West. The only adult right now in Europe and on the Eurasian continent is Putin. He's the sober-minded one. He understands the implications. That's one of the reasons he's been so methodical and so deliberate in the way he has moved, because he knows what he doesn't want, and he doesn't want a major war. But don't misjudge his sober-minded methodology for advancing slowly and carefully for a lack of resolve or capability. Russia has the resolve and the capability. That's what we need to understand. It's time for us to turn around and take a look at what we've got. Do we have the resolve and the capability? And that's very questionable in my judgment. And it has been from the beginning.
Well, I wish we had the time to also discuss Belarus and that standoff, but it appears we have run out of time. So,
well, remember, you still have 100,000 Russian troops in Belarus, and they're just north of Kiev, as well as the concentration of 300,000 in northeastern eastern Ukraine. So the tools are there. This thing can be brought to an end decisively, far more quickly than people realize. And it's time for the dying to stop. It's time to rescue Ukraine from the terrible tragedy that we've created in that country. But the people that created it are still in power.